On this podcast, you'll meet Evan, a very experienced teacher who's originally from Idaho in the US, but now Evan is in Europe, and he joined me to talk about teaching, travel, and artificial intelligence, among other things. Welcome to Aprender Inglés with Evan and Craig. Hello, and if you're a new listener to the podcast, you're very, very welcome. My name's Craig, and the aim of this podcast is to help you take your English up to the next level. Now, regular listeners will know that Reza is still not back on the podcast, but I have been in contact with him, and there is a very good possibility that he will be back next week. So I'm really looking forward to getting together with Reza, and I'm sure you are too. He's on his way to Valencia as I speak, and we should be able to find some time next week to record some podcasts for you. In the meantime, many thanks to Evan, who joins me on this week's podcast. And please keep listening until the end of our conversation, because I'll explain some of the vocabulary that Evan and I use during the conversation. If you want to see the vocabulary written, you can. There's a list in the show notes. Go to inglespodcast.com/428. And without further ado, here's my conversation with Evan Simpson. Last week I spoke with my old friend Bill from New York. If you didn't listen to that podcast, go to inglespodcast.com/427 for episode 427. And recently I've made a new friend, and I'm very happy to welcome to the podcast Evan, who's currently here in Valencia. Welcome to the podcast, Evan.
Thanks for having me on, Greg.
In fact, Evan is looking at me across from my desk in my flat, and I'm really happy that he's come over to see me today and record with me. Evan is originally from Idaho in the US, and I wasn't exactly sure where that was, so I Googled it. It's right up on the Canadian border, correct?
It sure is.
So I'd imagine in the winter it's pretty cold. How are you handling the Valencia heat? Because we're recording in August. What do you think?
Well, that's the funny thing that I always have to tell people is where I come from is an incredibly harsh climate. So winter's cold, summer's hot. So winter is minus 20 Celsius and summer's usually around 40.
So it gets as hot as it is here right now?
Or hotter.
Wow.
Yeah, but there's no humidity. So as opposed to it being like a sauna, it's like an oven.
So that's the difference between maybe a Turkish bath that's really a wet, humid sauna and a Swedish one that's dry.
You got it.
So you live in a Swedish sauna area.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Evan has got a lot of experience teaching English. He's taught all different ages, all levels, and all kinds of nationalities since 2003. But I want to start, Evan, with talking about your experience teaching abroad. I know you spent a few years teaching in China, and you've taught students from all over the world, more recently Japanese students, I think. What do you enjoy most about teaching? If I were to ask you, like, what's your niche? Would it be teaching young kids? Would it be business English? What areas of English do you most enjoy teaching?
Well, the funny thing is that I actually genuinely enjoy teaching all ages and all levels. My personal favorite is teaching motivated students. And so if I'm teaching young learners who want to be there, who want to engage and want to actually try to learn, that's a great time. If I'm teaching people who don't want to be there, I don't want to be there. And so honestly, to be 100% truthful, I have taught exam prep, I've taught business English, I've taught young learners, I've taught, as I like to joke around and say, I've taught K to gray. I've taught everything from kindergarten all the way up to people with gray hair that are in their 80s. And when people are engaged, it's just a lot of fun to do.
No, I agree 100%. I always said I don't like to be the policeman in the classroom, so I've never really taught young kids. But if the children are young and they want to learn and they're motivated, I've got no problem with that.
Oh, yeah. I had a great time teaching kindergarten. I had a room full. I had like somewhere around like 15 kindergarten kids that were all, between 5 and 6 years old. And we're all running around singing and dancing and coloring and playing different games and using English. And it was a great time. And I've taught, at some pretty prestigious institutions where people didn't want to be there, and it was considered perfunctory. They were doing it because they were expected to. And so in their mind, it was more important to be there than to do anything. And I was like, watching paint dry is more fun than this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, engagement and desire and motivation and just like helping students achieve their goals is just amazing.
And since COVID hit, and maybe before COVID as well, you've been teaching remotely. What's the most annoying thing for you about teaching remote students?
Probably the worst part about teaching remotely is that you're limited to only what you can see on the screen. And as far as they're concerned, they're limited to only what I can show them on my screen. And so it's really hard to get up and demonstrate things because we don't have enough space. And it's really hard to like bring in realia or any of these types of things.
What's realia?
Realia are things like if you want to teach the word glass, you hold up a glass. If you want to teach the word shirt, you can show people your shirt or glasses. You get the general idea, headset, anything that's real. But you can't really do that so much when you're on a very small little Zoom window. It makes it very difficult to bring in actual objects to a classroom, especially as things just come up naturally in the conversation.
So it's not as dynamic. I have a similar problem. I used to love games in the classroom, running to the board, doing group work, pair work, moving the students around, using Post-it notes to stick on different things. You can't do that on Zoom.
You are not doing running dictation on Zoom.
No way.
That is not happening.
Let's talk a little bit about working and traveling, because here you are in Valencia. You've been to many countries in Europe and you haven't finished yet. You're going on to travel further. Which places and cities have you worked in so far?
So far, well, that's the funny thing, because my wife and I, we were in Shanghai, China. I was working for a large institution, doing teacher training workshops throughout all of East Asia. And, I loved my job. I loved doing teacher training. But the problem was, my wife and I, we got tired of wearing pollution masks. So we decided to go to Berlin, and then COVID happened. And because of COVID...
Because, wait a second, they wore the masks before COVID.
Oh, yeah. My wife and I, we joke around and talk about being early adopters for N95 masks. So many people are... Now everyone knows what an N95 mask is, but we knew what those were back in 2015 when we were...
Because of the pollution.
Because of the pollution, exactly. And so needless to say, we left China, we arrive in Berlin on January 1st, 2020, and then COVID happens 2 months later, and the whole world now knows what N95 masks are.
Yeah, well, I do.
Oh, yeah. And so since then, we went from Berlin to Tirana, Albania. From Tirana, Albania, we went to Split, Croatia. We went to Rome. Now we're here in Valencia. And yeah, we'll see where the next stop is in our journey.
Very cool. One thing that occurs to me, for example, if you're in a city, how do you overcome or get over the temptation of, because you're working, right? You and your wife are working as you're traveling. How do you overcome the temptation of not going out, not going to the beach, not seeing the sights in the city where you are, and sitting down and being disciplined enough to work? Is that a problem?
Oh, no, that's actually pretty easy depending on what your motivation is. So for me, it wasn't never really that hard because I just had a very simple T-chart of money coming in, money going out. And so I knew I needed this much money coming in because I have this much money going out. And so it was a very simple thing to just sit down and work every day. As far as, like wanting to spend more and more time outside too, you got to remember, we weren't vaccinated when we first arrived in some of these places. So we definitely weren't going to be going out and being super social in those situations.
Yeah, I understand that. What are some of the other pros and cons of living this kind of lifestyle, traveling and working?
Well, one of the beautiful things is that, if you are a digital nomad, if you are someone who works online and travels all over, you can see very many places. You can learn a lot about different places. One of the downsides of it is that I joke around and tell people that the older I get, the more I believe in the life philosophy of Bon Jovi with the wonderful song Dead or Alive, where they say, it's all the same. It's only the names that change. The more you visit places, the more places you see, the more they all start to look alike. And so there comes a point where you become very traveled out and you've visited enough places and you're just kind of done.
And not to get too philosophical, but maybe some people travel so much where really if they stayed in one place and looked inside themselves, they might find what they're looking for rather than going all over the world looking for something that if they stayed in their own backyard, in other words, if they stayed at home in their own place, they could be maybe even happier.
Well, absolutely, because, as I remember my mother telling me a long time ago, there is no geographical solution to a personal problem. If you're running from yourself, no matter where you go, there you are.
When you worked in China, Evan, and your Chinese students, did they ever say to you that they had a preference between having a US North American accent or a British accent, or was that something that wasn't mentioned?
Oh, no, it was definitely mentioned, but a key thing that I always have to point out to people is this: China is huge. Absolutely, positively massive. It is larger than anything that most people can actually wrap their head around, about how you have just a plethora of cities with more than 6 million people. And so I had students ask me everything under the sun because there was just so many people. And there was always the likelihood that if you bump into enough students and you engage with enough teachers over a long enough period of time, the probability of being asked anything basically reaches 1.
In general, though, did they express a preference for one accent or the other?
In general, it depended on what their goals were. In Korea, it was American English. In Japan, it was American English. In Southeast Asia, it was British English. Whereas China, it depended mostly on the students themselves and where they were planning on going. So some of the students who were getting ready to take IELTS, they wanted British English. Students who were going to go to the US and they had to take TOEFL, they focused more on American English. But there were just so many students that, it varied.
Yeah, every student had their own personal goals and ambitions and places where they wanted to work or study.
Exactly. Whereas you compare that to in Korea, where at the time when I worked in Korea, the national curriculum was based on American English. And so that has serious impact on the country.
And what would you say to a student who said that they wanted to sound more like a native speaker? They weren't happy with their accent. What would your reaction be?
Well, my question to them was always like, why are you unhappy? How is your accent stopping you from communicating? If it's not stopping you from communicating, there is no problem. Because as I would always point out to them, I could show them any high-stakes language exam, and all the students I was teaching were eventually planning on taking either TOEIC, TOEFL, IELTS, or even Cambridge CAE, FCE. They were all looking at doing some kind of certification or award. And I'd always point out to them that the highest score possible in every single one of those situations, British Council's aptness exam even has it, where in none of those tests say sounds like a native speaker. It always says accent has no impact on intelligibility, as in your accent does not stop people from understanding what you're saying. And if your accent isn't interfering, there is no problem. If they wanted to be a voice actor, that was something completely different. But I only had like 2 of them. In almost 20 years, I've only had like 2 students that said they wanted to be voice actors. In that situation, I had to really think about it and then go through a lot of research on accent reduction and actual mimicry, which is very different situation compared to what 99.9% of students actually want.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Although even so, students say to me that they don't feel comfortable with their accent, that they don't have their personality translated into English because they feel that the listener's perception, how they think of them when they're speaking English, changes because they don't have the accent and they don't have the same communication and the same sense of humor as a native speaker would have. So I still hear that a lot from my students.
Well, of course, because there's a mixture of imposter syndrome there where people don't believe they're as good as what they really are. They don't believe that they're as proficient as they actually are. That's one aspect. And then the second aspect is when you're interacting with people who are not accustomed to being around non-native speakers, the onus is not on the speaker, the onus is on the listener. And so the people who are not accustomed to being around non-native speakers need to understand what their biases are and work to have a more inclusive view of what English is. Because you have, I always love this, you have more people learning English in China than there are Americans. And we just stop and think about that for a second. You have more people currently learning English in China than there are. And the United States is the third largest country in the world. In the US, the American population is approximately 350 million people. And you have more people learning English in China than there are people who speak English as a first language, because of course, not all those 350 million Americans, English is their first language. I just kind of shrug my shoulders and throw up my hands and say, understand that English is a global language. There's variations of it that are spoken all over the world. The vast majority of conversation and interaction in English is between non-native speaker and non-native speaker. The point is to be understood, not to sound like a movie star.
I'm pleased you said that because that's exactly what I think as well. The communication's the key. That's the important thing, not what kind of accent you got and if you sound like a Scottish person or a Canadian or a New York, whatever.
New Yorker.
New Yorker, thank you.
But I will never say it properly because I'm from the other side of the country.
So are you an Idahoan?
I am an Idahoan indeed.
Oh, that was a guess. Idahoan. I got it right. Fantastic. Now, I know that you have an interest in data collection and data analysis, and you also have a very interesting service that's connected to Twitter. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I want to ask you if you can think of any way that students can utilize or use data to maximize their study time to improve their level. That's something I've never really thought about. Although one thing does occur to me whenever a student comes to me and says, oh, I haven't got a good score in my Cambridge B2 exam. I say, well, okay, look at the paper. What did they tell you? And it looks like the listening's good, but the grammar, the use of English is a bit low. So obviously they have to work on their grammar. But that's only one point of data. So if they do 10 tests and repeatedly their grammar score is low, obviously that's the weak point they've got to hit and improve. That's the only way I can think of in my ignorance of using data to improve a student's study time. Can you think of anything else?
Oh, yeah. One of the most important things with studying is that it's just like you have to be Goldilocks. You can't do it too much.
Who's Goldilocks? Maybe they don't know.
Goldilocks and the Three Bears.
Right.
Goldilocks, she went into a house and she said, oh, this porridge is too hot. This porridge is too cold. This porridge is just right.
Who's sleeping in my bed? Was that Goldilocks?
That's Goldilocks. You got it. And so that's the whole idea. This fairy tale of just right, just right, just right. It's the same thing with studying, and everyone is different. And so you have to make sure that you're studying enough for you, because if you study too much, it's like a sponge. If the sponge is soaked, it can't take on any more water. You're not doing any good. And same thing, if it's too dry, it's not doing its work. So you need to make sure that you don't study too little and you don't study too much. And one thing that I saw students do 1,000,000 times over, and it drove me crazy, is that they were always doing their flashcards, and they would just bang through these flashcards, way too many flashcards. And it's like, almost all of those. They're like, yeah, I'm like, well, then stop reviewing them.
That's using one method of study, that's overusing it, concentrating too much on one, like listening only to podcasts and doing nothing else.
Exactly. But the problem in that situation is they're using the same flashcards and they're not adding new flashcards and they're not removing flashcards that they've already learned. So that's where the concept of spaced repetition becomes incredibly important, which is you want to make sure that you follow what's called the learning and forgetting cycle. And you want to make sure that you're on the learning and forgetting curve, which is the perfect time to review something is just before you forget it. And so that's what you want to do. And that can be very challenging for you to figure out by yourself. You can do it, or you can make your life really easy.
Use an app.
You can use an app.
Because they have an algorithm, right?
Yep. Algorithm's a fancy way to say recipe, a way to do something. That's all it is. And there's all these fancy words for terms that have concepts that you know that are very simple. And that's one of them, algorithm. The spaced repetition apps all use the exact same algorithm, which is completely open sourced that anyone can use. But there's a wonderful app that is free that you can use called Anki. It's ANKI. You can download the app for free. You can use pictures and sounds. You can use it to learn anything you want, and it'll do spaced repetition for you for free.
And this is mainly focusing on vocabulary, correct? And collocation.
You can use it to focus on whatever you want. I used it to learn data science for memorizing data science concepts and also reminding myself what are the steps in an exploratory data analysis. What are the 5 or 7 steps I would want to go through in order to do this? And so I used it to memorize these concepts. However, you might want to use it to remember all the different perfect tenses in English. Okay, no problem. You can use it to memorize anything. It works, of course, it works great with vocabulary, but the whole point of flashcards is if there's something you need to just rote memorize, this works really well.
Okay, thank you for that recommendation. Evan, I will put a link in the show notes over at inglespodcast.com/428. I will link to Anki, or as Evan says, Anki, so that you can go there and sign up for that app. Have you ever used any voice recognition software?
Yes, I have.
Tried any?
Yeah, oh yeah, I have.
What do you think?
Oh, it's all sorts of fun, but you have to remember that it's just that at this point, it's still just fun.
Yeah.
They're using all sorts of amazing stuff right now. Google has introduced amazing capabilities. By the time this podcast comes out, my recommendations and ideas might be out of date because they're moving that quickly. They're using deep learning in order to do Google Translate of lesser known languages like Quechua in Latin America, and also several different African languages as well. And it works incredibly well, much better than what they previously had. But yeah, I wonder when we will get to the point where we will have the perfect Babelfish moment.
Well, let's wait and see. I don't think it's there yet, but it is, as you say, getting better all the time. I did try Cambridge's Speak and Improve at speakandimprove.com, and my score was B1 level. So I obviously got some work to do with my English to get up to a proficient native speaker. So it's not there yet.
I've tried several of those apps as well. And as I'm sure you can imagine, I have never scored higher than B2 on anything. And so I understand that I still have many hours to go before I can get to a higher score as well, because they have an idealized speaker in their mind.
And it's not me.
It's not me either. I don't know who it is, but it's definitely not us.
Well, Evan, I want to thank you very much for your time today and for coming over and recording with me here in my flat. Before we go, do you have any funny or memorable or maybe embarrassing stories that you can tell us about your experience as a language learner, or something from your students, perhaps?
Oh, boy. I remember. Sorry. I remember vividly. I was living in Korea. I lived in Korea from 2003 to 2006. And Korean doesn't have tones, but it has very complex grammar, and it has very precise consonants where there's a difference between k and k. And there's a difference between...
Wait, I didn't hear a difference there. Can you do that again?
Yeah, there's a hard k and there's a soft k.
Okay, so it's more aspirated, the second one.
Exactly. The hard k has a heavier aspiration, and they have the same thing with g as well. And there's also a hard s and a soft sh. In a nutshell, there are several highly aspirated consonants in Korean that make all the difference in the world. And as I'm sure you can imagine, all those consonants, the more aspirated they are, the harsher they sound, which means they tend to be words that have a stronger meaning and more emphasis and more passion. So there I was in Korea. I'd been learning Korean for I think maybe 3-4 months. And I was in a restaurant and I needed a pair of chopsticks.
Chopsticks are those sticks that are used instead of a knife and fork in Asian countries.
In many, many, many Asian countries, exactly. And oh my Lord. So there I was. I'm sitting at my table and I have food, but I have no chopsticks. All right, fair enough. I know the word. So I shout, as you do in Korea, or as you did in Korea in 2003, I shout at the top of my lungs to the waitress who turns and looks at me, and I scream at her so that I can be heard, not screaming at her, just talking loud enough to be heard. And I scream at the top of my lungs. This is a direct translation. Older woman, please rip off your foreskin and give it to me.
And I should explain to the listener that the foreskin is the piece of skin that is on a male's penis.
This is correct.
And can you repeat that again? You said to her, older woman?
Older woman. I was using the polite term.
So you were being polite.
Of course I was being polite. I mean, I'm not going to be rude. I mean,
of course not. When you ask for foreskins, you have to be polite. You have to use the correct form of address.
Exactly. The key thing is to make sure that everyone understands, like that, you're doing things by the numbers. You're doing it correctly. And a hush fell over the restaurant.
Quietness.
And I had no idea what had just happened. And just everyone, you could hear a pin drop. And I mean, the place had been really loud just a second before. And so needless to say, I'm looking around like, well, I did something wrong. So I just start making the universal symbol for chopsticks, which is you put your index and your middle finger together and you touch your thumb and you just keep moving them over and over and over again. And I said, this please, this please, this please. I just kept repeating it and looking around like, because I see a whole bunch of men looking at me like, what did you just say? I'm like, I don't know. Don't ask me. And I was just terrified.
Well, Evan, before we go, I know you are actively teaching at the moment. Could you tell people how they can get in touch with you if they're interested in taking classes with you? And also maybe speak a little about the Twitter service you're offering at the moment.
Okay. Well, as far as getting in touch with me for teaching, I will make sure that we have a link in the show notes to my sign-up page, which is all about, at this point, I'm looking to expand as well. But I do all sorts of different types of lessons for teaching speaking for IELTS. But I'm moving on now to focusing on teaching English for AI and English for machine learning.
AI being
artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence.
This is my area that I'm moving into because I've told people this story a million times and I still have a hard time believing that it's true. I took 1 year of math in high school. And I graduated from high school. Actually, I took 2 years, but in my opinion, one of those years really shouldn't have counted. But the important thing though is this, I don't have a math background. My background's in literature. But I started teaching, and the longer I taught, the more interested I got in why my students weren't achieving their goals. And so I just kept going down different rabbit holes, trying to learn more and more about teaching and testing and language assessment. And that's how I got really interested in statistics. And once you get interested in statistics, you go down the rabbit hole of AI. And so now I'm at a point where I can use AI for language teaching and training. And so at this point, I'm looking to teach people who are interested in AI, who are interested in machine learning, and who need to give presentations or need to be able to discuss different aspects of AI in English. I'd be more than happy to deliver lessons for those students and be able to help them achieve their goals.
So if you are interested in that, you can reach Evan by going to the show notes, inglespodcast.com/428. You'll see a link to his sign-up form. And what about the Twitter service?
Well, the Twitter service is more for people like yourself, or podcasters and other content creators who are looking to attract more listeners or more viewers. And so what I do is I help you identify listeners or potential viewers via Twitter. I mean, the great joke that I like to say is like, whose audience would you like to steal? But in reality,
You're not really stealing the audience, though, are you?
of course not. What you are doing is you are asking me to help you find their audience, and I will then help you identify who their audience is and then give you tips, tricks, and tools so that you can engage with them.
Yes, and Evan was speaking to me and explaining this to me before we started recording today, and I understand that I could sit and look at Twitter and go into people's accounts and spend hours, days, maybe even weeks identifying these people. And what Evan's service does is it will present you with these Twitter handles a lot quicker than you actually filtering through these yourself. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. Because I want to say it's from Isaac Asimov's book, The End of Eternity, but I've read too much sci-fi at this point. I'm getting too old and everything's starting to blend together.
Tell me about it.
I don't think I have to. Needless to say, the important thing is this. If I remember it is from the Asimov book, End of Eternity, where he says, computers don't learn better than humans. They just do it faster. So it's the same thing. If you want to take and look through someone's entire Twitter profile and look through all 140,000, well, there are 140,000 followers and the 70,000 people that they're following, and identify 10 people that you would like to talk to.
It's going to take a while.
It'll take you some time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just saying you might want to use computers for what they're good for and use people for what they're good for, and being able to very clearly identify the difference between the two. And so that's one of the things that this service provides, is using computers for what they're good for.
Thank you very much, Evan, for being on the podcast this week. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I hope we'll get to speak another time on another podcast on another day.
Sounds great to me. I'd love to be back.
I hope you enjoyed listening to that conversation with Evan. I certainly enjoyed recording it with him, and it was a lot of fun. Let's look at some vocabulary from that conversation. Evan spoke about something that's really, really boring. He said, watching paint dry is more fun than this. Obviously, if you watch paint dry, it takes a long time. Nothing's happening. It's really, really boring. So you can use that expression for anything that's a boring experience. Oh, it was terrible. It was such a boring film. It was like watching paint dry. Evan also talked about the downside of something. The downside, he said, one of the downsides is. That just means one of the disadvantages, one of the negative things. Evan also said that China is larger than most people can wrap their head around. If you wrap your head around something, you understand it. The spelling of wrap here is with a W, W-R-A-P. It's the same verb you would use, for example, to wrap a birthday present or wrap a Christmas present, to put paper, coloured paper, around something. So if you wrap your head around an idea or around a concept, that means you understand it. Obviously, if you can't wrap your head around it, then maybe it's too big, you can't imagine something that huge, and that was the idea that Evan was putting across, was communicating. China is larger than most people can wrap their head around. And when describing China, Evan said there are a plethora of cities, a plethora, P-L-E-T-H-O-R-A, a plethora of cities, a large or maybe excessive amount of something. Another example, there's a plethora of language schools in Madrid. There are lots and lots of them. Remember, to see these words and the explanations, go to inglespodcast.com AIRC428. Another expression you heard was the onus is on the listener. Onus, O-N-U-S. If the onus is on the listener, it is the duty or responsibility of the listener. If I say the onus is on you to solve the problem, it is your responsibility, it is your job to solve the problem. Evan also talked about flashcards for learning vocabulary. Now, in language teaching, a flashcard is usually a small card with some information, often on both sides. So maybe on one side of the card, there is the word book in English, and on the other side, the word libro, if you're a Spanish speaker, or if you're learning Spanish. So you see the word in your language and you try to remember the other word that's on the other side of the card. Now, it could be another word on the other side. It could be a picture to help you remember things. So a flashcard is an aid, something that helps you to learn vocabulary. Another expression that Evan used was in a nutshell. A nutshell. Nut is, if you're a Spanish speaker, nuez, and the shell is the hard outside of the nut. And this expression means briefly, in summary, or in the fewest possible words. Let me explain it to you. In a nutshell, it means blah, blah, blah. So I'm being very brief, very concise when I talk about a nutshell, in a nutshell. With Evan's very funny story about asking for chopsticks in a restaurant, he said that he shouted at the top of his lungs. Your lungs, L-U-G-S, that's the organ inside your body that you use to breathe with. So if you shout at the top of your lungs, you're shouting very loudly. I shouted at the top of my lungs. You can also say at the top of my voice. I shouted at the top of my voice. And with Evan's story, the punchline, the funny part of what happened to him in the restaurant was that he asked the woman to rip off her foreskin. So to rip off, the phrasal verb means to remove violently. Sometimes if you have a plaster on a cut in your body, people say that the easiest way to remove the plaster is to rip it off, to take it off quickly and violently. And foreskin is the skin at the end of a man's penis. When he said this, by mistake, a hush fell over the restaurant. A hush, H-U-S-H. That means the restaurant became very quiet. You could hear a pin drop. If you can hear a pin drop, there is almost complete silence. So a hush fell over the restaurant was Evan's expression. It was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. And speaking about his passion for AI and deep learning, Evan said that he went down a rabbit hole. If you go down a rabbit hole, a hole where rabbits live, that idiom means to enter into a situation or maybe to begin a journey that's particularly strange or problematic or difficult or maybe complicated or chaotic. If you remember the film, if you've seen the film or read the book, Alice in Wonderland, you'll remember that she went down a rabbit hole when she was chasing the white rabbit. And strange and unusual things happened to Alice. Another example could be that I was searching for something on Google and I found an interesting article, and then I watched a video on the same subject, and then I read another article. So it took me away from my original investigation and I went down an interesting rabbit hole. So in a similar way, Evan went down the rabbit hole of AI. The links that Evan spoke about, his machine learning and AI English classes and his Twitter service, you can see those on the website at inglespodcast.com/14. AIRC428. But now it's your turn to practice your English. We would love to hear from you. Why don't you send us a voice message and practice your English? You can do that by going to speakpipe.com, speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast. Or you can send us an email with a comment or question. You can reach me at Craig, Craig, at inglespodcast.com. Or to send Reza an email, send those to belfastreza, Reza, at gmail.com. If you're interested in studying English with a paid course, we encourage you to visit the Mansion Ingles online store. You can find that at store.mansioningles.net. And before I go out the door this week, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of you who continue to help us by supporting this podcast on Patreon. You too can join our Patreon program for as little as $1.20 per month, and that includes the VAT tax. With that, you get instant access to recent transcriptions, which means I send the transcription to you every week and you can read every word that you hear in these audio podcasts. For more information, go to Patreon, patreon.com/Ingles podcast. Unfortunately, there's no time to mention everybody who's supporting us on Patreon, but we would like to thank recent Patreon supporters who have joined us this month, and they are Manuel Prado, Edgar Velandia, Alberto Valverde Conde, Olga Fernandez, Fernando del Cerro, Melissa A. Daorta, and very special thanks to Ana Criado, who is supporting us on Patreon for more than the $1 minimum. Many thanks to you and to everybody who's supporting us on Patreon. As I said at the beginning of the podcast, I really hope Reza can be with us next week. But whatever happens, there will be another podcast next Sunday. Please join us for that. Thank you for listening this week. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please tell your friends so that more people can listen. The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.